Welcome back, everyone. So, where we left off was concluding the discussion about the primarily palliate-headed members of the Helenieae Alliance. And for this segment, we're going to talk about the epalliate members of the Helenieae Alliance, exclusive of Eupatoriae, which Ed will cover later. So, George Bentham, highly influential 19th century botanist, published a system of classification of Compositae in 1873 that was in many regards similar to Cassini's. And this was a system widely followed by subsequent Sinanthropologists. And in this system, he recognizes Helenieae again and Eupatoriae as well as a separate tribe. But unlike Cassini, he treated Helenieae as a tribe distinct from the Helenieae. And this was one component of Bentham's system that was largely abandoned in the mid to late 20th century by Sinanthropologists, who widely regarded the Helenieae as an unnatural garbage can assemblage of taxa that either belonged to Helenieae or various other asteroid tribes, and especially the Senecio. But then in 1981, Harold Robinson published a complete systematic reevaluation of the Helenieae in the broad sense and recognized there are 14 different epalliate, we could call Helenieoid subtribes, and concluded that there was, quote, more phyletic integrity among the epalliaceous Helenieae than generally recognized by recent workers. So that was a very groundbreaking study because he focused on micro-synanthropological characters, things that previous synanthropologists hadn't focused on as much, and was able to tap into data that were otherwise previously unexamined. And one of the conclusions of that study was that genera with bristly papae, a pappus of bristles, that had often been placed in other tribes on that basis really did belong to the Helenieae in the broad sense. And these are some of the genera that he included that had often been placed in other tribes, and especially Senecio. So today the Helenieae is recognized as a tribe in a narrow sense, and there are other epalliaceous tribes within the Helenieae Alliance, but this is the one with the red arrow here that includes Heleneum, and we could call core Helenieae. And it doesn't encompass that much diversity in terms of species, only about 120, but a lot of morphological diversity is within this group. And as you can see, it's sistered all the other New World tribes of the Helenieae Alliance. So it's really important to have a close look at it. As I mentioned earlier, this is the one tribe in the Helenieae Alliance that does not have phytomelanin in the fruit walls at all throughout any of the members of this group. And so in that regard, it's like members of the Inulae or other taxa outside the Helenieae Alliance. And here you can see some micrographs of a blanket flower fruit wall. And these micrographs, you can see the structures labeled KP are calcium oxalate crystals or rhaphides, which there can be 1 to 3 per epidermal cell in the fruit walls, and that are quite large and can actually impart a scaly appearance texture to the fruit wall. So this is a feature that we find in the Helenieae that's distinct from that of any of the other members of the Helenieae Alliance. And here again here's a phylogeny based on ITS for Helenieae sensu stricto, just to give you some orientation within the group. There are 5 subtribes that we recognize now for the Helenieae, and they're quite distinctive and worthy of brief mention. So here's the core subtribe within Helenieae, the Gaillardianae, in the strict sense that includes these 3 genera, Helenium, Gaillardia, and Baldwina. And they stand out with regard to their receptacles, where the florets are attached, they're often deeply pitted or even spinose, with projections that might be mistaken as receptacular bracts until you realize that they're not bracts at all, but they're just projections out of the receptacle. These can be quite large in Gaillardia and Baldwin. And also the filaries are often reflexed or spreading at maturity. And I should have mentioned too that the receptacles can be quite enlarged, as you can see, for example, in the Gaillardia and the Helenieae here that have globose receptacles. Tetranurinae is a very diverse, relatively diverse subtribe of the Helenieae, and these are often called paper flowers because the ray corollas are often persistent and dry out, becoming papery, like you can see in Silostrophy down in the lower left. And Mark Bierner's done a lot of work on the relationships within this group, and his findings were upheld by work that we did as well. Tetranurus and Hymenopsis being particularly diverse groups, and these are quite diverse in the desert southwest. Also in the desert southwest are the Sapharotony, and this is a subtribe we erected for the so-called turtle plants. You can see why they're called that in the photo of Sapharotes there in the upper left. From a distance in the desert, the mound-like growth form of Sapharotes can be mistaken for a tortoise shell. And these have discoid heads, which was a bit confusing, and they also have pappus of free or coalesced bristles that led to their long being treated in the Senecio tribe. And this group also includes a genus not included here, Palooka, which is an anagram of Plukia, which used to be placed in the Inulae or Plucae. That's a large woody plant primarily found in the islands of Baja California, in the Gulf Islands. All of the members of this group are also united by a really distinctive odor. They put off volatiles that have a very turpentine-like scent. And the Marshalliinae is worth mentioning. It only includes one genus, Marshallia, from the eastern United States. Very anomalous. They're discoid-headed, and they are unusual in having cyanic coloration of their disc corollas, these blues and purples, and a strongly thickened so-called palea, but it's actually a projection from the receptacle like we see in the core Helenieae. And the anthers are sometimes tailed, which is something we don't normally associate with Heleanthe alliance. They also have an odd secondary chemistry and a low chromosome number, and they're sister to the rest of the Helenieae, consistent with Robinson's treatment of them as outliers within the Heleanthe as a whole. So next I want to talk about the tribe Tageteae, which is one of the more diverse tribes and one of the more distinctive tribes among the epaleate tribes of the Heleanthe alliance. It's about 267 species and many genera. This is a group that we reinstated back in 2002 and expanded its circumscription, now including about 32 genera. And the group, as it was traditionally recognized, sometimes its subtribal rank within Heleanthe as Pectidinae, is very easily diagnosed by these schizogenous foliage glands that you can see on the filaries of the porphyllum in the upper left. And if you look closely at the pectus in the lower left, you can see the foliage has these schizogenous glands as well that basically form pits or cavities and that emit volatiles that have a really strong odor. So the pyrethrins, insecticidal compounds of Tageteae are a great example. But there are also taxa that are part of the same clade that don't have these glands at all. No vestige of them evident. And their position within the group, an example being Clappia down in the lower right here, it comes mostly from features of the fruit and pappus. So the fruits are generally 8 to 10 ribbed, deeply ribbed fruits, like you see here next to the Clappia photo is a fruit of that same species. They also have a pronounced carpopodium at the base of the fruit, this little stalk, and a pappus of bristles or dissected scales that are comparable to what we see in the core part of the tribe that have these aromatic foliage glands. And so this is a group that's very diverse in the desert Southwest and further south into subtropical climates. So I now want to turn to a couple of tribes, the Chaenactideae and the Bahieae, that together only add up to about 100 species or so. And you can see from Jennifer Mandel et al.'s paper that these are groups that are associated with North America, primarily Mexico and north, in more desert-like climates, and are reconstructed as ancestrally being of more northerly origin within the New World. So the Chaenactideae is not too diverse in terms of numbers of species or genera. There are only 3 genera, each of them shown here, Chaenactis, Orochaenactis, and Dimersia. But they're very interesting evolutionarily, and we've studied this group quite extensively. Are concluding a study right now that we're preparing to submit on chromosome evolution and ecological evolution in this group. Dimersia is a very strange plant with 2 florets per head, and they're clustered together, as you see here. Its relationships were obscure until the molecular data were obtained. These are all discoid-headed genera. Sometimes, though, the marginal florets are enlarged to form radiant heads, but there are no ray flowers. And they're mostly herbaceous. The leaves are generally petiolate, and the corollas are usually white or cyanic. There are some yellow coloration. There are some plants with yellow disc corollas, though, as you can see in Orochaenactis here. The pappus is comprised of non-costate scales typically, unlike the costate scales of the sister tribe Bahieae, or in the case of Dimersia, they're bristles. So this is another case of a genus that was misplaced because of a bristly pappus. And in Dimersia and Orochaenactis, the pappus falls off as a unit. It's deciduous, which is unusual. And they're great examples of evolution of chromosomes by disploidy, descending disploidy, in this case associated with a shift to more arid climates. So a great example of Stebbins' principle that harsh environments will select for a reduction and recombination, which could benefit plants of drier environments where there isn't much margin for error in terms of gene expression, in terms of survival in the harsh conditions. So there are perennials in Chaenactis, including subshrubs, and we have great evidence that these are descended from the annuals. And this is just one example, I'll mention a couple others later, of perennials being derived from annuals within the Helenieae alliance, which is a fairly common theme associated with shifts to montane or coastal environments. So the next major tribe is the Bahieae, sister to Chaenactideae. And this is a group that is broken up into a number of clades in this diagram that are worth mentioning briefly. The overall distribution, the overall tribe is characterized by a pappus of basally or medially thickened scales, or of fascicled or hooked bristles or awns, in addition to having fruits that are striate or not. They differ from Chaenactideae, as I mentioned, in having the medial thickening of the scales, and we don't get this kind of clumping of bristles in the Chaenactideae. So we treat these 2 tribes separately because Chaenactideae is a fairly long branch tribe, and they're morphologically different enough to where it's difficult to diagnose a tribe that includes both. So the Bahieae clade, the most diverse clade down here in pink in the lower part of this ITS tree, is one we've recently published on about 5 years ago now, looking at relationships that led to a generic revision. And what we found there was that the phyllotaxy was more conservative evolutionarily than we thought. So having alternate versus opposite leaves turned out to be diagnostic of fairly deep clades that cut across genera that had been miscircumscribed. So we have a better taxonomy now, but in any case, this is a group that shows quite a lot of, this particular clade shows quite a lot of morphological and ecological diversity, primarily in the desert southwest, getting into northern Mexico pretty far. This is a very bizarre member, Apostates, monotypic and endemic to Rapa in the Austral Islands of the French Polynesia, previously placed in the Aster tribe, Asterae. But the results of phylogenetic study show that it's actually nested within this Bahieae clade of the Bahieae, and is clearly an example of long-distance dispersal of intercontinental magnitude from North America, and it certainly does reconstruct as North American now. This is one of several examples of long-distance dispersal to islands within the Helenieae alliance. The Pygmy Cedar, so-called Pusiphyllum, monotypic genus shown in the upper panels here, used to be placed, well, it is placed in the phylogenies as sister to Sapharotopsis, which is a genus that used to be placed with Sapharotes that I mentioned earlier, those turtle plants that are actually part of the core Helenieae. But instead, Sapharotopsis is part of the Bahieae. And all of these plants are discoid with bristly papae that led to this confusion. Chaenactideae with Bahieae, which are a couple of New World, primarily Mexican genera, both monotypic, were placed by Bentham with Jaumea, which actually is more closely allied with Tageteae, the marigold tribe. And we found that these two Mexican genera, Chaenactideae, shown on the left with its very broad phyllaries, similar to those of Jaumea superficially, but not imparting a close relationship, and Bahieae, which has similar phyllaries, those two genera of Bahieae are actually most closely related to an African genus, Hypericophyllum, which is actually somewhat diverse, is radiated a bit in southern Africa, and hadn't been recognized as part of the Bahieae clade previous to molecular phylogenetic work, another case of long-distance dispersal. Okay, with that, we're going to stop and take a break before we conclude the Helenieae alliance in one more segment focusing on the Metae.